Hey film fans, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter, and this is another episode in my ongoing series about punk cinema. If you had a chance to watch my interview with Dr. Temmuz Gürbüz, which you can see right here if you haven't, and it's a fascinating interview, she's amazing. One of the things we talked about is whether films that aren't necessarily about punk or involving punks or featuring punk music, etc., can be considered punk cinema. And one of the names that came up was Gregg Araki. His name also came up in some of the comments to my introduction to this series, and so I wasn't originally going to do this film, but I thought his name keeps coming up, and I keep reading about overlaps between punk cinema and new queer cinema, which Gregg Araki is kind of one of the founding directors of, or one of the progenitors of, depending on how you want to define all that stuff. So I thought I'd dive into this film and consider this. Can it be considered punk, maybe aesthetically, or based on its production values, or its anti-establishment? There's a lot of ways to think about punk, as we've talked about in this series, that aren't just our Sex Pistols on the soundtrack or whatever it might be. So please join me as we consider this 1992 new queer cinema classic, The Living End, on this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Hey everybody, before we get into the film, just a quick reminder that on my channel, I don't monetize my videos. If you see ads, those ads are placed there generally by the copyright holders of films that I discuss, and I never turn on monetization. I do all this for free, voluntarily, but as all YouTube channels do, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of energy, and so on. So if you want to support me a little more than just by watching and thumbs up, which I love that stuff, keep doing that, you can head over to my Patreon page and you'll get access to other videos as well, most specifically my weekly The Week in Movies kind of digressive ranting thoughts about whatever's going on in Hollywood and outside of Hollywood. So thanks for that in advance, and thanks to all my patrons past and present. I know some people have come on and supported me for a month, 2 months, some people have stuck it out for quite a while. Thanks to you all, and thanks to everybody who might head over there now. The Living End is a 1992 film, and it was written and directed by Gregg Araki, who also did the cinematography and the editing. And when you see those credits on a film, you know that this is a labor of love and that this was done probably with a very low production budget. In the case of The Living End, just around $20,000. So one thing to keep in mind before you go into this film is that it is low budget. When I was talking about Repo Man in the last video, I described it as low budget, which it was. Repo Man was $1.5 million, which in the 80s was low budget. $20,000, if you had Repo Man's budget, you could make like 70 or 80 The Living Ends. That's the difference. So 20,000 versus 1.5 million. They're both low budget, but there's a big difference in terms of the economy of scale and all of that sort of stuff. In addition to Araki, though, the film also features a really important score by Sasha Konietzko. And Konietzko is a guy who has different names, DJ names and so on, who considers himself the progenitor of industrial techno. I don't know enough about that music and its history to know if that's true, but there is this kind of industrial techno, sometimes kind of lo-fi, sometimes almost ambient in its kind of pace and volume, but it's there throughout the film, and it really adds to the film's its ambiance, but also it's the tension, which is a very important part of the narrative, and if we can say there's a message, the message. There are quite a few people in the film, but the main cast are Mike Dietrich, who plays Luke, Craig Gilmore is John, and Darcy Marta, who is Darcy, who's John's best friend, kind of his straight soulmate in a way. And another thing to keep in mind before you go into this is that part of the film's low budget aesthetic is that the performances are what we might describe as non-professional. This bugs people. I teach film studies, and one of the things that my students will comment upon a lot when we watch low budget films is the acting. And I always just encourage them to try to see what the film is doing. Try to see what the film is attempting. Someone like Iraqi, especially early in his career, is going to make a film like this, going to scrape together the money, going to shoot it, edit it, and so on, because it's important to him and to any filmmaker working on a budget like that. And they're usually going to get people together that they know, friends, people from acting class, all kinds of things like that. And it's a labor of love. That doesn't mean you have to like it. Some people are going to watch The Living End or other low budget films, and the performance just, it's going to take them out of the film. My recommendation is always to give it a chance. Not everyone can make a film with a Hollywood budget. And that's not just performance. That can be sound design, that can be the cameras that they have access to, or the camera equipment like dollies or tracks or car rigs or these sorts of things. There's all kinds of stuff that low budgets prohibit filmmakers from acquiring. And that's an important part of the production. It's also an important part of the kind of political economy of Hollywood as a gatekeeping industry. Different video, perhaps. So keep all of that in mind. You've got a guy who's coming up as a filmmaker. He's a young filmmaker. It's 1992. We're still in the sort of Reagan-Bush years, which this film's very much about. And we're still at a time, even in the 90s, which Gen Xers often try to think of the 90s, myself included, as this sort of return to progressive politics. And it was, but in a very post-Reagan baby steps kind of way. So when we think about queer cinema, depictions of homosexuality, on-screen gay men and love, this isn't something that Hollywood's going to be like, yeah, bring it on, right? They're going to gatekeep the hell out of stuff like that in 1992. Remember, this is at a time when the AIDS crisis is still, which is what this film's very much about, is still not being dealt with, not being confronted, not even being acknowledged by a lot of mainstream America. So to have a gay man show up and say, I want to make a road movie about two men falling kind of desperately sexually in love as they confront their situation in life in regards to AIDS and positive HIV diagnoses, that's not something that Hollywood's going to jump on. So that kind of gatekeeping there is going to prevent the kind of funding that a film like this may have got. The 90s were full of hetero, outsiders on the run movie, and, some of them quite nihilistic, like Natural Born Killers or California with a K, the Brad Pitt film. All kinds of films like this. So it's not that Hollywood was averse to lovers on the run committing violence, throwback to Bonnie and Clyde, and that sort of thing. But it was definitely still averse to those lovers being two men. So one of the things to keep in mind when you watch a film like The Living End is that its production limitations, which the film overcomes in a lot of fascinating, intriguing ways, but those production limitations are, if not directly, de facto imposed upon it by an industrial system that says no. On that note, and before we get too far into the film, I should say about my own experience that new queer cinema is not my area of expertise, and the history of queer cinema and gay cinema is not my area of expertise, although, as many scholars have shown, the history of Hollywood is tacitly, at the least, also the history of queer cinema, just very closeted. So I loved this film, and I'm really excited to talk about it for this video. But if I get things wrong or leave things out or, don't fill in a complete picture, you savage me in the comments if you want. But if you'd prefer, maybe enlighten all of us with anything I might have left out. Let's get into the movie. What's the film about? As I've said, it's a road movie, and like all road movies that are about sort of exploration of space, exploration of geography. It's also an exploration of, you know, the characters' inner selves or their place in life, their lot in life.
So now what? Now where do we go? Wherever! Here, there, this way. I don't care. What difference does it make?
I mean, you go back to Bonnie and Clyde, they live by night, whatever it is. These are people on the margins, for whatever reason, who aren't just on the road, you know, literally. They're on the road here as well. There's John, and John is a film critic. He's writing an article about the death of cinema. And he is in his late 20s, and he seems to be somewhat successful for a guy in his late 20s in early 90s Los Angeles. He's got a nice flat, he wears nice clothes, he's got a nice haircut. He and his friends seem to be in that place where they've kind of lived their 20s and they're on the verge, maybe, of what comes next. You know, if he can just land that full-time gig, he's freelancing, then, you know, things are going to turn around for him. And as the film opens, John gets a positive HIV diagnosis.
Positive. Sorry. Now let me explain what this means. The test...
So this is what the film is about. It's about HIV, and it's about America's unwillingness, as I've already mentioned, throughout the 80s, not just to confront or do anything about HIV, but to acknowledge it at all. And there are thousands and thousands of American men dying out of, you know, willful disengagement. Willful ignorance isn't even the right word for it. It's a willful brushing under the rug of a death crisis. And John walks into this crisis with this diagnosis. And so he spends most of the film in crisis, and that's a very important part of his character. And, you know, we spend a good part of the early film establishing the world, and in that world is Luke. And Luke is a sort of live free or die drifter. And we get these different encounters that he has, including with these two murderous kind of homicidal lesbians, played by Mary Warrenoff and Joanna Wenton, who keep threatening to take him out after they've picked him up.
His love gun. All right, Daisy. I'm gonna blow his fucking face to smithereens.
Sweetie pie, put the heat away. Why would I be interested in this boy's petite little taste of Vienna sausage?
And these scenes are funny and sort of over the top, but they also introduce the film's overriding concern with, obsession with, you might even say, death and the death drive. It's not just about death. It's not just about the fact that John and Luke, who we later find out is also HIV positive, that these guys might die because of this willful ignorance or worse. It's not just about that. It's about an acceptance of the death drive, like a point where you or one realizes, I'm gonna die. Fuck it. I'm gonna die. Death is what's in store for me. Now, it doesn't necessarily take a positive HIV diagnosis for someone to go through that. Lots of people go through that because, you know, facts are facts. We're all gonna die. But when you get diagnosed an illness, whatever it is, HIV or cancer or something else, in the midst of a healthcare crisis where people with that diagnosis are dying and dying quickly, you know, this is kind of pancreatic cancer. This is nothing to be done cancer, is what an HIV diagnosis was for most men in the 80s and the 90s. And it didn't have to be, as we soon found out, but it was at the time. And so one of the film's kind of vital, ironically, vital concerns is how does one live when one has accepted death? Luke has already made that acceptance as he comes into the film. He doesn't give a flying fuck. He just wants to like live out these days on his terms. He's already there. John is not, and part of what the film's about is John's process of resisting that, stepping closer, pulling back, stepping closer, especially after he meets Luke and they become these kind of lovers on the run. And Luke is trying to pull John there.
So, like, figure this. There's thousands, maybe millions of us walking around with this thing inside of us, this time bomb ticking, you know, making our futures finite. Suddenly I realize, we got nothing to lose. We can say, fuck work, fuck the system, fuck everything. Don't you get it? We're totally free. We can.
And there's tension in that relationship because on the one hand, Luke thinks he's doing John a favor because now that Luke has, you know, made that acceptance, he feels free and he wants that for John. But at the same time, he doesn't quite get, or he doesn't quite acknowledge, or whatever it might be, that John has to go through his own process to get there. And there's a lot of tension in this relationship. These guys are kind of madly, physically, emotionally in love. They have a wild time together. They have wild sex together, and they become attached to each other. And yet John is resistant throughout. And so that tension, even as the two of them go on their trip together, that tension of what is John going to accept and what is he not going to accept is kind of one of the overriding conflicts of the film that keeps it going, even as the two of them come together as lovers on the run. What's punk about the film? Well, there are a few things that are worth considering. First, music is very important. There's very few references to punk, but there are a lot of references to kind of 80s and early 90s post-punk. John is a big music fan.
I mean, we're talking about a guy who went into severe depression for 2 weeks when Echo and the Bunnymen broke up.
Echo and the Bunnymen there. We see a Misfits t-shirt throughout the film. We get little visual references to bands like Joy Division and the Jesus and Mary Chain. And then we have this industrial kind of post-punk heavy soundtrack. And none of this is punk per se, but it's in that sort of, you know, what the next generation of hard music fans would have been listening to after punk died, gave birth to other kind of post-punk musics. There are also some sly references to punk in a couple of instances. For example, near the end of the film, in a particularly kind of weighted, dramatic moment, one of the really intense moments in the film, when Luke's talking about his blood, they've been on the road, they're starting to realize that this isn't working, and Luke's kind of getting philosophical, morbidly philosophical about his blood and his inability to feel the HIV in his blood. It's a really kind of tragic and sad moment, and John makes this comment.
Our holiday in the sun is over.
And it's hard not to see in that little snippet of dialogue a reference to the Sex Pistols' Holiday in the Sun. Another reference that has to be intentional, even though it may not have been super intentional, is the appearance of all of this Ralph's generic products throughout the film. Like here. Someone who's well-versed in punk cinema can't look at that and not see Repo Man. So you know that, you know, Iraqi, just like the Repo Man production people, Coxon, etc., are making this on a low budget. So probably he's like, let's just get the stuff from Ralph's. And in fact, we see them go to Ralph's at one point in the film.
Oh, that's pretty. Didn't your mom ever teach you to eat with your mouth shut?
My mom got killed by a garbage truck when I was about 3.
There's no chance that Araki's like putting Ralph's generic products in the film and not going, people are going to think of Repo Man. Of course you are. You can't look at that and not think of Repo Man. There's another really interesting reference early in the film, and I'm not sure this one's an intentional punk reference. I'm going to read it that way. But it also is a very important reference for other reasons, and it's a very important line in the film that can almost come across as cliche, but it's there for a reason. Everything in this movie is there for a reason, by the way. And that's when we hear this line.
Live fast, die young, leave a beautiful corpse.
And that's only 3 minutes into the film. Live fast, die young, leave a beautiful corpse. Now you're watching this and you might be like, oh my God, that's a cliche. Where does that line come from? A lot of people associate it with James Dean. James Dean lived fast, died young, left a beautiful corpse. Also, though, a gay icon with questions about, some of you who know more about this can elaborate in the comments, but questions about his sexuality and his gay relationships. But also, it's likely that James Dean picked it up from the director Nicholas Ray, who directed Rebel Without a Cause. Where might Ray have picked this up? Ray had made a film with Humphrey Bogart called Knock on Any Door, a kind of social realist working class drama, and he made a few of these films, and he also made a few films with Humphrey Bogart. Knock on Any Door was based on a novel by a writer named Willard Motley, and Motley was an African-American writer living in Chicago. He was a novelist and a journalist, and Motley's story is fascinating. Don't have time to go into it, but Motley is a writer who was black, but who mostly wrote white stories. And at the time and after his death, he was somewhat disregarded for that, because this was at a time in the 30s and 40s when, kind of at the end of and post Harlem Renaissance, black writers like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison were really, exploring the black experience in America and writing these amazingly compelling novels about it. Zora Neale Hurston as well. And Motley is writing novels about white people, Italian Americans, ethnic people, but not about black Americans. Motley was also gay, and he wrote mainly about straight relationships. So at the time, I don't know how out he was. I don't know how well known his sexuality was. But after his death, when people would look at his writing and say, here's a black gay man in Chicago, and he forewent his own experience to write something that might be more palatable to white audiences. But since then, as queer studies has grown, there's been a kind of reinvestigation. He hasn't been totally, as far as I can tell, I might be wrong, totally kind of reclaimed, but there's been this investigation of his work as queer-centered, as someone who's writing about otherness, other from him and otherness from his experience. And there's a lot of sort of coded queerness in his novels. And in Knock on Any Door, he writes, live fast, die young, and be a beautiful corpse. And so that, I think, is an illusion that Araki may or may not have been aware of, but adds a kind of intertextuality to this film. And the film is like bursting with intertextuality. But also, just to come back to the punk question, live fast, die young! Live fast, die young! Live fast, die young! Circle jerks. Aesthetically, the film is, one could call it punky. It's very much part and parcel with the early 90s, the kind of pre-Tarantino indie scene in America, and that could be anyone from Jim Jarmusch to Hal Hartley. in that it combines a mix of sort of conventional framing, conventional cutting with less conventional shots. So we'll get scenes where people's heads are cut off, or we'll get, you know, strange framings that don't look like what Hollywood would look like. One of my favorite shots is this shot is when the two guys pull over to the side of the road so that Luke can take a piss, and look at how it's shot, how it's framed, and what they're talking about.
Yeah, I ever tell you about the time I saw this bag lady jump off a skyscraper? It was at the corner of Hollywood and Vine during rush hour. Man, it was just like in the movies. This big crowd gathered around, the cops came, the fire department came and stuff. Everyone was all trying to talk her down. I mean, people who wouldn't even give her a nickel if she were begging in the street. Now all of a sudden her life became this fucking precious thing to them. Well, she took the plunge. She landed feet first. She bounced back up like 10 feet in the air after she hit. And the sound of it, man. Oh man, I'll never forget it. It was so loud, like this thunder crack. Every bone in her body shattered at once. Fucking gnarly. Man, I'm starved. What's for lunch?
That is just a kind of beautifully composed and awkward framing for that. And I love it because the framing doubles down on the awkwardness of the conversation, the story that Luke's telling, and the fact that he's pissing. And the film is full of sort of male shitting, pissing, bodily excretions, which I think goes into it being like an honest male movie, not just a gay movie, an honest male movie, but also ties into the film's obsession with blood as one more sort of bodily fluid. So the film is very kind of body-centric in this way, which is an important part of its aesthetic as well. Another choice that the film makes that I think is fascinating and must be intentional is that between almost every sequence, there's a cut to black. Now, if I got this in a script from one of my students, I would say, you gotta get rid of that, man. For a lot of reasons. You know, conventionally today, in the sort of, you know, 2020s, for the past 20 years even, we tend to try not to include transitions in screenplays. It's not like a rule that you can't do it, but by transitions I mean like how do we cut from one scene to the next? So you could just write cut, or cut to, or dissolve to, or fade to black, fade to white, cut to black, cut to white, and so on. And these days that's considered directing in the script. That's considered the editor's job. The director and the editor together will decide how to do that. You just put in, you know, your scene ends, and then you put in the header for the next scene, and so on. So if I had a bunch of scripts, or if I had one script that had a bunch of cut to black, cut to black, cut to black, it's kind of my job as an instructor who's trying to get these people out of university prepared for the industry, to just kind of remind them that cutting to black after every scene is going to look amateurish. But I also, you know, because I like indie cinema and I like the avant-garde, let them know that there are reasons to break the rules, and sometimes those reasons work. And this is one of those cases, because at first the cut to black is kind of surprising. Why, you know, the first time, there's a cut to black, another cut to black, another cut to black. Why does it keep doing this? This is unprofessional. Greg Araki edited it. He doesn't know what he's doing. This is a first-time filmmaker. Blah, 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 blah. This is death. Interrupting this film after every scene. That's how I read it anyway. These cut to blacks are intentional. They're little moments of obliteration in the film. And I tried, if anyone has any insight into this, please let me know, because I did search for actually quite a few hours to find out, like, why are all the cut to black or cuts to black in The Living End, and I couldn't find a Rocky talking about it. If anyone has a video where he talks about this or anything, even a printed interview, I would love to read it, because to me, these cuts to black, the weight of them, the sort of accretion of the weight of these cuts to black become an aesthetic choice to impose upon the viewer these little 2-second moments of death. The film is dead. The film is dead. The film is dead. And it's almost like, to me, and maybe this is a bit melodramatic on my part, but this is like, if each of those cuts to black is another death, this is a reflection on AIDS in America and how it's treated. There's another death and another death and another death, and it's constant. So when you watch a film like The Living End, as I said, it's obsessed with death. It's obsessed with, you know, why are gay men being allowed to die, but it's also obsessed with those men's journey to acceptance of death. We must look at it in the context of the time, and we must look at it as not just, I want to be very serious about this. It's not just the kind of film student meandering of, oh, we're all going to die one day. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We all go through this phase of, you know, into this world we're born, into this world we're thrown, right? We're all like, we didn't choose to come here, and we're all going to leave here the same way, very different ways, but the same way, dead, right? But all of these men, all of these little deaths who have died up to 1992 and beyond, didn't have to. They didn't have to. And I feel like these cuts to black, maybe I'm completely misreading this, but I feel like these cuts to black are a constant aesthetic, practical, physical reminder on the part of the filmmakers of that fact. Speaking of death and how it might come about, it turns out that Luke has a gun, which he picks up in that early scene with the two women who's picked him up. And in the middle of the film, he and John have a talk about the gun, and it leads to this startling, and I'm sure if any conservatives had watched this at the time, sort of, offensive proposition by Luke.
What do you say we go to Washington and blow Bush's brains out?
There is a great idea. Can you at least hide that thing?
Or better yet, we can hold him at gunpoint, inject him with a syringe full of our blood. How much you want to bet they'd have the magic cure by tomorrow?
I said put the gun away.
This line, I mean, on the one hand, it's very kind of juvenile, but on the other hand, it's the same thing that, you know, abortion activists say. Like, if men got pregnant, abortion would have been legal 5,000 years ago. There would be drive-up abortion clinics that you could just, whoop, done. And it's the sense that the people who are in power, who are empowered to control the lives of those with less power, are the same people who, A, don't have to deal with this, and B, because of their position, have the power to deal with it, which leads to C, their refusal to do so. And when you have those conditions where your situation is being legislated or not legislated, attended to or not attended to by people, men in power, who could attend to it, who could make it right, and they don't, it's easy to see how a wish like this could come about, become prevalent, and become verbalized. And one of the things that I really like about Luke is a lot to take in this film. He's overbearing. He has no qualms about saying what he thinks, doing what he wants. He is really this kind of living free kind of person, which can be a lot. But he has made his peace with it. And so when he says something like this, he's both joking around, like obviously you can't drive to Washington and assassinate the president or inject, that would be even harder, to inject him with a vial of blood. I think Luke would if he could. But also he has no qualms joking about it. He has no reverence for a system that is going to treat him like a walking body bag. Why should he? Like really, why should he? And so people watch this line, and others like it in the film, and are, oh dear, the president, like, you might not like the man, but you have to respect the office. Why? Why? It's not just the man, Reagan, Bush. It's the office. It's the full weight of the executive and legislative administrations of American government at the federal and state level for the most part, with cities doing a lot of the early work in the AIDS crisis. Ignoring a holocaust of death. Why would you respect that? Why would you want to respect that? Why would you feel like you have to respect that? The film doesn't, and we get it in this title. It's serious, man. It's death that this is about. Like, and when that is like real, and when that's your topic, like respecting the office is not going to be an overriding concern. As all of this kind of underrides it, making it sound serious, and it is serious, but there are funny parts, there are very well choreographed and orchestrated parts. There's a moment when the guys realize they need money, and Luke gets out to get money, and he goes to the ATM machine, and the ATM machine is busted, or it's not working, whatever it is, and this unfolds.
The fucking machine's out of order.
That's a fantastic scene. The sound design, the cutting, the editing, the way Luke's whole decision is framed and then orchestrated, all of it works really well, and it intensifies the danger that these two men are in, but it's also really funny, and there's a lot of this kind of dark humor throughout the film, and it done in these kind of, you know, aesthetically unconventional, but at the same time really pleasing fashions that makes the film a joy to watch throughout. Another key element in the film, which I guess you could call its B-story, is Darcy's story. And Darcy is John's best friend, and Darcy's straight, and she's the gay guy's best friend character. And in a lot of ways, this is a flip on a lot of sort of 80s and 90s rom-coms where the female protagonist has a gay best friend. Those roles have been swapped, so now the protagonist is the gay man and the best friend, the female best friend, is the sidekick or whatever it is. And I won't go too much into it, but Darcy's story is quite interesting, and I think it's part of a deeper critique of this film that I might not be the best to unpack here, but it's a critique of heterosexuality, and it's a critique, I think, of cinematic depictions of heterosexuality. Darcy's in this relationship that may at one time have been loving, it seems like that, and may at one time have been exciting for her, but now is a chore.
Let's go to bed.
I think I'm gonna work for a while.
Whatever.
And it's a chore for a lot of reasons, part of which is that her lover, her boyfriend, her partner, doesn't get her. He doesn't listen to her. He doesn't see what she's going through. He wants to have sex with her, and she's having an anxiety crisis. He doesn't recognize her personhood, and so he starts cheating. And this story unfolds slowly after the men leave, after Luke and John go away. And a lot of the film is John, not a lot, but a lot of key moments are John and Darcy trying to connect with each other by phone, leaving messages. And it leads up to this moment, which I actually showed briefly in the interview with Temuz, where Darcy just is freaking out. I don't want to get into how the film ends. It's a beautiful ending to the film in a lot of ways. It's tonally, aesthetically in line with the rest of the film. It's beautiful in both its lovingness and its darkness. But I do want to look quickly at this kind of penultimate or climactic scene, because it gets to the power of this film, I think, in a punk way and in a queer way. That just is this film to watch is a film that's in your face. It is, in a lot of ways, as Araki announces in the opening credit, irresponsible, but it's in your face irresponsible. And we get this scene near the end of the film where the two guys, John's like at his wit's end, he's in love with Luke, he's turned on by Luke, but he still hasn't quite said goodbye to his old life. He still hasn't accepted this kind of, or embraced this his new reality. And so he can't quite say yes to Luke's way of life. And they get into a fight, and they get into a fight about the gun, they get into a fight about everything, and here's how it unfolds.
What do you think you're doing?
You'll never, ever find anybody who cares as much about you as I do. Don't you see that?
Don't be stupid. You wouldn't have the balls anyways. You fucker! Mellow out, man! Mellow out! Mellow out, man! Go ahead, fucking blow my brains out! Go ahead, motherfucker!
The imagery there is so powerful, particularly if you go back to the context of the time, when, you know, we're having discussions on American talk shows about whether, like, little kids who are HIV positive, for whatever reason, can go into the swimming pool. You know, this was something that America's talking about, like ostracizing children because of their spit, which doesn't transmit HIV. And here you have this very, I think, aggressive, but also tender and loving moment where Luke licks the blood, and it's so in your face. But by the time you get there in the film, the messy, the wild, the sexy, the brutal love that these two guys share for each other has been presented as a reality. And so that moment is one that's both sort of incredibly tender and incredibly in your face, which I think is a good way to describe the film as a whole. And it's one of the things that makes it powerful and that I think makes it punk. And if you go back through all the videos I've talked about, whether it's Jubilee or Decline of Western Civ or the depictions of Sid Vicious in the Sex Pistols films, it's this idea that for a lot of the music and a lot of the cinema, punk facing out is aggressive, it's anti-establishment, it's in your face, it's irresponsible, it's and part of the reason it is that is to protect what shred of tender, emotional feelings these young people who've been betrayed still want to cling to. And that moment with the blood captures that dichotomy just perfectly. In short, it's a really great film. It's provocative, it's moving, it happens at a very fast clip. I mean, you will not get bored watching this film. If you can step beyond your aversion to the low budget, like the very low budget, and kind of accept it for what it is, this film will move you, and it will also, it should anyway, provoke your thinking and maybe even enrage you a little bit. So you should definitely check it out. Thanks to Temu's for suggesting it. Also to one of my users, the Based God Max. Did I get that right? Yeah, the Based God Max, who also suggested Iraqi early on in this project. I'm going to do a couple more documentaries, and also coming up in November, it's 2 years of Movie Talk, and I've got a live stream cooking. I'll tell you more about that soon. Thanks everybody for watching. If you've made it this far, as I always say, please like, please hit the subscribe button. Please let me know in this video like what I missed, what I got wrong, what I should have said, etc. I'm happy to hear your comments. Share this with your friends. Share it in your class. If you're taking a class right now on new queer cinema, you know, maybe some of your fellow students might want to hear these thoughts. Maybe not. I don't know. In any case, hit the subscribe, head on over to Patreon, come back next time, and until then, everybody, keep watching movies.